Zelensky has judged that by having, invading an incursion into Kursk, that would not only embarrass Putin, force him to do something about it, and potentially undermine his position back in Russia. Now, there's a couple of things to unwrap in there. One of which is, Putin is sustained by a democracy of sorts. Not really. It's the oligarchs that keep him up there. And Putin also controls the narrative out to the country. And if that narrative is we're winning, it's nothing to worry about, all of a sudden a whole area of the country has been invaded. 120,000 people have had to be evacuated. They all talk. And of course, it is another chink in the dam.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're once again talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine. And I'm delighted to be joined by the former fighter pilot, military analyst and co-host of the Red Matrix podcast, Sean Bell. Sean, always a pleasure. Welcome back to Frontline.
Hey, James. Thanks for having us again.
Now, this is a very important week because President Zelensky is in New York for the UN General Assembly. We're expecting him to address the UN General Assembly on Wednesday this week. And of course, he'll have lots of meetings significantly with President Biden and other world leaders. Where do you think we are in terms of Western support for Ukraine at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, how long have we got and where's the bottle of wine to answer that question? Frankly, if you look at the war from a grand strategic perspective, it's not really been going Ukraine's way this year. If you look at it as fighting seasons, I know it's flippant, but when it gets into the late autumn, early winter, it's freezing cold. It's very much more difficult to conduct maneuver warfare. At the start of this year, Ukraine was waiting for $60 billion of aid. It didn't come. That left them short of weapons. Russia capitalized. Jumped on the front foot, and it's been the tale of the war this year, with Russia pushing harder and harder forward. And we can talk about that certainly in more detail. But the Ukraine pushed into Kursk, but potentially as a distraction. Has that really worked? Probably not. And still, the Russians are pushing forward. Now, Ukraine knows full well that it relies heavily on the West for financial and military support. If you remember back, was it last year, the spring offensive, the West effectively opened the cupboards, said, we can virtually give you whatever you want. If you can, break through. It didn't happen. The West has continued to supply weapons, but, it hasn't, it's almost certainly helped the Ukrainians, but it hasn't stopped Russia grinding away in this war of attrition. And the worry here, I think, in big picture is that the stockpiles of Western weapons upon which Ukraine has relied are virtually empty. And therefore, you rely now on a factory spinning up, generating new weapons. And that's not as easy as it sounds to do. Yes, you can generate bullets and artillery shells, dumb weapons relatively quickly. But frankly, the more weapons like that you provide the Ukrainians, the more you drag them into a war of attrition, which is just the war they don't want to fight. And I think one of the really important things about Zelensky's visit is that he's apparently going to be briefing US leaders on his victory plan. We don't know much about it, but we understand that there are three components to it, one of which is, the supply of weapons, the future supply. How do you stop this being feast and famine? How do you provide a degree of continuity? There's also about how the West provides more coherent diplomatic pressure, bring it to bear on Russia. And finally, how you hold Russia accountable long term for this illegal invasion. But again, behind closed doors, who knows what's actually being talked about. But I'd be very surprised also if they're not also talking about the use of long-range weapons, which President Zelensky has been regularly appealing to the West to try to take the restrictions off and allow him to use the weapons as he sees fit, providing they're used in accordance with the law of armed conflict.
Just want to come back to something you said a moment ago, Sean, when you said that the Kursk incursion hasn't appeared to work. I suppose that depends on how you're defining working and what it was, what it set out to achieve. Clearly, if it was intended to divert troops away from the front line in the east, Russian troops away from the front line in the east, in a way that would significantly prevent Russia making incremental advances in the east of Ukraine, that hasn't really happened so far, maybe to a small extent, but not massively. But some would say the big achievement of it is proving to Ukraine's Western allies that they can physically invade Russian territory and Putin won't reach, for example, for tactical nuclear weapons. It exposes once again this idea that some of his red lines are bluffs. And obviously what we're waiting on, and it'll be interesting to see if we get confirmation of this at the UN General Assembly, is any kind of announcement when it comes to Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles being allowed to be used by Ukraine to hit targets inside Russia. And if that happens, a lot of people say that will be linked in part to the Kursk incursion because it further proves that these red lines are just bluffs. What's your response to that?
Well, James, I think you're entirely right. I mean, it's probably too early to judge whether it was a success or otherwise. I have to say, the danger is when you've done something and it hasn't really achieved what you expected to achieve, you then look for other reference points to try and claim success. I have to say, as a purely military guy, you generally operate, you've never got enough resources to do everything you want to do. So you have this lovely term of main effort. Where do you focus your priorities? And it's very dangerous to have more than one main effort. And what appears to have happened is that Zelensky's judged that by having, invading an incursion into Kursk, that would not only embarrass Putin, force him to do something about it, and potentially undermine his position back in Russia. Now, there's a couple of things to unwrap in there. One of which is, Putin is sustained by a democracy of sorts, not really. It's the oligarchs that keep him up there. And Putin also controls the narrative out to the country. And if that narrative is we're winning, it's nothing to worry about, all of a sudden a whole area of the country has been invaded, 120,000 people have had to be evacuated. They all talk. And of course, it is another chink in the dam. But do most experts believe that's going to be enough to topple Putin? Almost certainly not. And the worry is, of course, that from a military perspective, you put potentially 10,000 of your fighters, Ukrainian fighters, into an area of Russia that really doesn't count. And Russia can fix those fighters there whilst it worries about fighting in the Donbass. And if you look at it purely in a sort of graphic, objective perspective, Russia has accelerated its progress in the Donbass since the time of the Kursk invasion. Now, again, you can't directly link those two because as a military guy, I would argue that Russia is pushing hard in the Donbass to try to achieve its objectives before the end of this fighting season, because frankly, Russia is losing so many soldiers at the moment that it's faster than it can actually recruit them. Therefore, it's not a sustainable model. But if, and there's a big if Putin can complete that task before the winter settles in, that times with about the time of the US elections. It's possible there will change of administration, possible that President Trump might try to do a deal with President Putin, and therefore he'd want to be at that situation, that talk, in a most powerful situation that he could be. So overall, I think it's too early to say, but it doesn't appear to have achieved the objectives that President Zelensky probably would have wanted from that incursion.
If we do get confirmation that the West will allow Ukraine to use Storm Shadow missiles to hit targets inside Russia, how big a difference will that make, Sean? I'm conscious of the fact that for months we were talking about the F-16s potentially being a game changer. And in and of themselves, yes, they will make a difference. Some might say they're making a limited difference already, but they're not going to transform the war. There's no one game-changing weapon. But how significant would you say the Storm Shadows are?
I think less significant than possibly we in the media are sort of painting them out to be. I think if we go back to the F-16s, I think they could have been a game changer, but for the fact that Ukraine has so few pilots that are trained to operate them. If rumours are to believe, there's less than single figures of pilots. So it doesn't matter the fact that they've been promised 85 F-16s. If you've only got a dozen or so pilots, then there's very limited effect you can actually achieve. I think the weapons front, though, is interesting because I have no doubt at all that the supply of weapons, let's take Storm Shadow, because that's one of the weapons we talk about. In big handfuls, I think the UK bought about 1,000 of those 30 years ago. Cost about 2 million each. I think in the intervening period, we've used less than 200 of them in actual conflict. It got to the stage where they were time expired and we therefore needed to upgrade them. We've decided to upgrade not all of those that are remaining. I understand it's only a few hundred to be upgraded. And that left us with several hundred of these missiles that we either disposed of, that would have cost us money, or we stored them, that would have cost us money. So one of the options when the war happened was, yes, we can give these weapons to Ukraine. It saves us money, but also because it's 30-year-old technology, we're not that worried if that falls into the Russians' hands. My point being, though, it's a very limited supply of those weapons. And my understanding is that the Ukraine's had most of them already. So the fact that if they gave them the permission to use them even further inside Russia, Ukraine would still be faced with this very limited supply. I think the story that's happening behind the scenes, excuse me, much more important is that either you make or buy. And if you can't buy something, you have to make it. And one of the things that's interesting at the moment is Ukraine seems to have developed its own skunk works, its own way of rapidly developing weapons. It's developed its own ballistic missile, and it's developed its own long-range drone. Now, you can't just suddenly magic that from nowhere. I wouldn't be at all surprised if the West is providing technology and components, but now they're a lot easier to provide in bulk. As long as President Zelensky's team can put them together, if you're in the West, you'd have to do a whole load of safety cases. You'd have to make sure that you did loads of test flying to make sure that they were robust and credible. That can take years. If you're in Ukraine, you don't do any of that. You bolt them together and fly them on a mission. So I think and we've seen over the last few weeks, a much increased tempo of very effective strikes by Ukraine deep inside Russia, beyond the range of Storm Shadow and ATACMS missiles. And I suspect the conversation behind closed doors is that this is not about giving Ukraine a military effect. The danger is that the overwhelming issue is political, that actually by giving Zelensky permission, that political intent inflames Russia. And therefore, why would you do that? If there is another way of giving Ukraine the capability they need, which is the technology and the components, then maybe they can build them for themselves and potentially do it a lot quicker, a lot cheaper, and a lot more effectively.
It's interesting, Sean, you mentioned earlier the three pillars, we believe, of Volodymyr Zelensky's victory plan. And one of them is about having a consistency of supply when it comes to weaponry, because at the moment it's been very stop-start, a splurge of military aid from the US and then nothing for several months, and then maybe the Storm Shadows, but after a bit of a wait, and then maybe the F-16s, etc. How do we resolve that? Because, of course, even though it would be nice to think politics doesn't come into it, domestic politics in the US, domestic politics in Europe and the UK does come into it, and that has caused issues with the supply of military aid.
Well, it goes back to an earlier question, James, and I'll have a go at sort of tap dancing around it a bit because it's very inflammatory. Part of that is, what are the prospects for Ukraine? At the start of the war, it looked like Russia was going to push right in. Then Ukraine in October 22 managed to push a whole load of the Russians out in the Kharkiv region. 23, much vaunted spring offensive didn't come to anything. 24 will be remembered for Russian pushing forward. Now, if you look at it really in a binary form, Ukraine wants to get rid of Russians from every part of its territory. Does that prospect look more or less likely today than it was a couple of years ago? Frankly, it looks a bit less likely. As a result, how will this war be brought to an end? One option is that, because clearly, ultimately, it's up to President Zelensky to decide. But he's not the only stakeholder in this because he's relying so heavily on the support of the West, not just physical support, but moral support, particularly, as you say, domestically. All the countries are questioning, should we be spending so much money over there when we've got our own requirements here? And I think you're seeing a gradual erosion of the hope in the West that Zelensky can ultimately prevail. And even some of the language around this is starting to talk a little bit more about how you position Ukraine ready for that negotiation. My worry about all of that, of course, is that ultimately that rewards President Putin for his aggression one way or the other. And that has profound implications for global security. But I do think it's inevitable. We're living in this country. We've just had the winter fuel allowance. We've had all debate about money, that there isn't any. So therefore, the prospects of continuing to spend a lot of money in Ukraine, whereas we have lots of domestic needs as well, is really difficult. And finally, on the weapons front, bluntly, if you want to get a load of high-tech weapons built, it costs a lot of money and takes years to get the facilities set up. Is the government going to do that in this country, given that if it thinks that in the next year or maybe two, that the war will be brought to an end, you've developed this whole defence industrial base at huge cost, which then goes, what do we do with it? And it's all very well saying that we can build our own weapons. Let's be really clear. The weapons we're giving Ukraine are not the state-of-the-art weapons that we have in our inventory. We will not do that because we do not want to compromise our own national security. So if you're going to develop new production lines, you've got to develop production lines to build slightly older weapons or slightly less capable weapons that are not cutting edge. That is not easy to do given the pace of modern technology to retrofit sort of capability. So it's not as easy as it sounds just to ramp up domestic production.
And there's also the point about, okay, there's been a lot of focus on Storm Shadows and F-16's offensive weaponry, but actually, Ukraine still desperately needs more air defense systems. Whether there are enough Patriot missile systems, I don't know. But you've got F-16s currently now having to do almost a defensive job on air defense when a lot of the Ukrainians were hoping they would be an offensive weapon.
Yeah, and I think that the F-16 is an interesting one because as a former fighter pilot myself, I never saw the F-16s being something that was going to be decisive in this conflict. Given the time it takes to develop your pilots, your training, your engineers training, the support, it felt like when the war is over, that Ukraine would need to have its own credible military capability to defend itself, to deter further aggression. And fast jets will be a key part of that. So what the West was doing was, let's not wait until the war is over before we start doing that. Let's start training their pilots so that when the war is over, very much quicker, you can give a credible deterrent. I think what happened, though, was as the war dragged on, who'd have predicted that we'd have been still here in the midst of a war like this? I suspect they thought, right, the Dutch and the Danes were prepared to give their F-16s. The initial pilots were being trained. Why don't you start to use them? And when you do use them, the danger is they're very likely to be shot down by their own side because Ukraine hasn't got a very integrated air defense system. It's not got a credible military jet presence. So bluntly, the guys on the front line, if they see a jet, they'll shoot it down because it will be Russian. So you've got to be really careful before you start putting Ukrainian jets into harm's way. And let's face it, the one that we've heard has already been shot down sounds like it was shot down by Ukrainians. So that sort of reinforces my aim. Going back to your point about air defense, though, I think the problem is Patriot sounds like the answer to the Maiden's Prayer, but they are millions of dollars per missile. You just can't, they're never going to be available in sufficient quantities to shoot down everything. And again, you're back to how do you have a layered system so that when the Shahed drones, these little cheap and cheerful drones come across, they need to be shot out of the sky with cheap bullets. And then you have a layered system that gradually works out and save the Patriots for the really difficult tasks out there. That's a layered defense system. That's what President Zelensky has been appealing to the West. And the West has been providing a whole spectrum of different weapons to help him with those different threats.
I think what is so fascinating about this whole discussion about a victory plan for Ukraine is there is a massive elephant in the room, which is, well, how are you defining victory? Because different people will define victory in different terms. Clearly, Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky have polar opposite definitions of what victory looks like. But somewhere in between, you would assume if there is going to be a negotiated settlement, that is where a negotiated settlement is going to be reached. And it's difficult because I know there'll be lots of people watching who understandably recoil at any suggestion that Ukraine will have to give up sovereign territory. But that is a debate that some people are having behind closed doors. Equally, Russia will hate the idea that Ukraine could end up in the EU, for instance, or with NATO membership, but maybe that is what Ukraine needs long term in order to guarantee its future territorial sovereignty. So what do you think, Sean, a viable peace settlement may look like? I mean, this is the $1 million question, and we may still be some way off it, but maybe this is the unspoken thing at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, James, I've been around this space for quite some time now, and as you say, very rightly, people get inflamed by the answer. So let's put a couple of caveats out there. First of all, retired air vice-marshal, former fighter pilot, has no sway in how this goes. It's ultimately up to President Zelensky and the Ukrainian people to decide how they want to end this conflict. It does look very unlikely that Ukraine will be able to liberate all its lands. it's very difficult to see how they do that. Even with a surge of Western support on weapons, that wasn't able to be done. And therefore, it's going to be very difficult to do that. I think the element of pragmatism is if President Zelensky wants to keep fighting, the reality of it is that the supply of weapons can't really increase. If we're fortunate, it'll stay level. And the risk is it just perpetuates a war. More and more people die. And Russia is the bigger nation. And the danger is that Ukraine gradually risks losing even more than it's lost already. And that's a judgment that the Ukrainians have to make. Whenever you come to a compromise, I mean, let's face it, these negotiations only happen if one side wins, and it doesn't look likely either side will win, or both grind to a stalemate. And we're almost seeing that a little bit in the Donbass at the moment. You know, as I say, Russia is still pushing forward, but my goodness, is suffering an awful loss rate. But it appears that President Putin's given the take this at all cost, and therefore they're just throwing bodies at it to try to seize the remaining part. Once you've got there, yes, stopping the war, part of it will be about territory. And again, let's be clear, there are parts of the Donbass now that Russia has already started rebuilding, bringing people down from or deep inside Russia to populate them. And therefore, even if Zelensky was able to liberate those areas, they'd be populated by Russians who don't want them there. So I just don't see how that's manageable. The pragmatic solution, however unpalatable, is some form of line drawn on a map. The real issue then is about how do you ensure security for Ukraine? You know, the Budapest Memo of 1994, you know, President Putin said that he guaranteed Ukrainian sovereignty in return for them giving up their nuclear weapons. Well, 20 years later, he ripped it up and in he went. So a bit of paper won't suffice. Will Putin be happy for Ukraine to join NATO? He's made pretty clear he doesn't want NATO on his doorstep, so I suspect that will be a difficult one. But that doesn't stop the West having bilateral or trilateral arrangements with Ukraine to try and provide security. And the third one is how on earth you rebuild the country. By all accounts, it's closing in on $1 trillion worth of repairs and damage, getting the economy back on its feet again. Just really, really difficult. But as we started the conversation with, I sense that at the start of the war, there was huge appetite in the West, public to support the Ukrainian people. We looked after them in our homes and we provided support. I just sense there's a weariness now that domestic priorities are starting to loom larger. And that's not just true here, it's true in America as well. And therefore, and there is a certain logic that says, you know, this is brutal, it's wrong, Russia should never be rewarded, but how many more lives have to be lost? Is there a way of drawing the war to a close and preserving what is left of Ukraine and helping Ukraine flourish and become, like Germany did after World War II, one of the powerhouses of Europe? Ukraine, with the support of the West, could do that. Incredibly emotive, James, as you and I both know, but as a pragmatist, as a warfighter, there is a point at which you just can't keep fighting if there's no prospect of actually winning. And it's difficult to see how Ukraine's going to make any sort of breakthrough. But maybe the victory plan that Zelensky's been presenting to the US will have some really interesting elements in it. But let's see.
We should mention that you're about to fly out to Ukraine. Tell us a bit about why it was important to you to visit and also how we can keep tabs on your progress whilst you're there.
Yes, I mean, what's been fascinating about providing commentary ever since the start of the war is that as a military guy, you know, you really need to be on the ground to get a real sense of, because it's all very well providing commentary about the weapons and the military perspective, but actually the moral component, which is the tenacity, the courage, the bravery of the population, is not something. I've never been to Ukraine, so I'm self-funding a visit over there just for a week, nowhere near the front line. I'm way too old for that sort of thing now. But three objectives: one, to better understand the landscape on the ground, talk to people, have coffee, beer, have a meal out, just chat. Second one is that I spent 2 years of my life, 3 tours in Afghanistan, saw firsthand the horrible effects that landmines and the like have on our young men, predominantly, and women who are amputees. And the Ukrainians are suffering at least 100 times more amputees. There's an initiative in Lviv to the west of the country called Superhumans. I'm busy raising money for them. I'm going to visit that facility, trying to raise enough money to help 10 Ukrainian soldiers with their rehab. It's about £1,000 a time. And the third objective, I'll be in Kyiv, the mother of one of the fast jet pilots who died. His call sign was Juice. Some of your viewers may remember that. He lost his life fighting for Ukraine. And my mother used to worry about me as flying fast jets in conflict. I have a family member who flies in the military as well. As a result, I think it's going to be really good to have a chat to her. I've got a couple of gifts for her as well, but basically get inside her head and how she's feeling, given that she's made a huge sacrifice for her nation. How does she feel about that? And how does she actually keep in touch with lots of the other pilots around? So I'm doing on behalf, we do, as you mentioned about Red Matrix, I'll be trying to do a daily update, which people can track through Red Matrix on TikTok and the like. And I very much look forward to coming back and talking to you about it, hopefully when I get back.
Looking forward to hearing all about it. Sean, always appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thanks, James.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.